Victor Petrov stood at the podium of David Geffen Hall, his baton raised like a king's scepter, commanding the 100 musicians before him with the imperious precision that had made him both legendary and feared. The New York Philharmonic bent to his will as they rehearsed Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, each note executed with technical perfection that somehow managed to sound hollow, like a photograph of a painting rather than the painting itself. At 42, Victor had conquered every major concert hall in the world, collected 2 Grammy Awards, and maintained a kind of severe handsomeness that made society women compete for his attention at fundraising galas. His salt and pepper hair, slate gray eyes, and the custom-tailored Tom Ford suits he wore to board meetings projected exactly what he cultivated: untouchable brilliance. But beneath the surface of his perfectly controlled world, a restlessness gnawed at him, the nagging sense that something essential had gone missing from his music, though he'd never admit it, not even to himself. In the second violin section, 28-year-old Maya Chin sat with impeccable posture, her fingers moving across the strings with fluidity that seemed almost effortless despite the complexity of the passage. Her long black hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her dress, a modest black concert outfit she'd bought secondhand on eBay, marked her as one of the orchestra's newer members, someone still establishing herself. To the casual observer, she was just another talented musician in a sea of talent, easily overlooked in the grandeur of the Philharmonic's roster. But Maya's dark eyes tracked every movement of Victor's baton with an intensity that went beyond mere obedience. She was analyzing, questioning, feeling the disconnect between the notes on the page and what was being coaxed from them. What no one in that rehearsal hall knew was that Maya Chin understood music in a way that even the great Victor Petrov had long forgotten, and that knowledge was about to change both their lives forever. The tension in the air was palpable as Victor suddenly stopped conducting, his baton hand dropping with theatrical displeasure as he glared at the violin section, where an imperceptible imperfection had occurred. "Again," he commanded in his thick Russian accent, a single word dripping with contempt, from measure 120. "And this time, perhaps you might consider play with something resembling passion, instead of mimicking a computer program." The orchestra members exchanged familiar glances, another one of the maestro's moods, and prepared to begin again, knowing that challenging him meant risking everything they'd worked for. But Maya Chun, watching his rigid shoulders and hearing the coldness in his interpretation, felt something crack inside her careful silence, and she couldn't stop the words that came next. "Maestro, perhaps if we approached the passage with more rubato, with actual human feeling rather than mechanical precision, it wouldn't sound so lifeless." The rehearsal hall went silent, every musician frozen in disbelief, as Victor Petrov slowly turned to face the second violin section, his face darkening with a rage that promised swift and terrible consequences. Hello, my friends. Before we continue our story, leave your like, share the story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Victor's office on the 3rd floor of Lincoln Center resembled a museum more than a workspace, with walls displaying photographs of him shaking hands with presidents, accepting awards from European royalty, and conducting in the world's most prestigious venues. His desk, an imposing mahogany piece that had once belonged to Leonard Bernstein, dominated the room, flanked by shelves holding scores annotated in his precise handwriting and a collection of vintage batons from legendary conductors. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Central Park sprawled beneath him like a green kingdom, a view that cost more per square foot than most New Yorkers earn a year. He stood there now, his back to the door, cell phone pressed to his ear as he finalized details for a guest conducting stint in Vienna, his voice smooth and confident as he negotiated fees that would make his already substantial salary seem like pocket change. This was Victor Petrov's world, elevated, exclusive, and entirely under his control. "Victor, darling, you were magnificent today." Irina Volkov purred as she glided into his office without knocking, her stilettos clicking against the hardwood floor with practiced seduction. The Philharmonic's concertmaster was 40 years old but looked 35 thanks to excellent genetics and an even better plastic surgeon, her platinum blonde hair always perfectly coiffed, her designer wardrobe carefully chosen to emphasize her still impressive figure. She'd been Victor's lover for 3 years, their relationship an open secret among the orchestra members who knew better than to gossip where either of them might hear. Irina wrapped her arms around Victor's shoulders from behind, her perfume, Chanel No. 5, because she believed in investing in classics, filling the space between them. That little Chinese girl was completely out of line today. Irina continued, her tone shifting from seduction to venom with practiced ease. Who does she think she is? Questioning your interpretation? Victor turned to face Irina, his expression hardening at the memory of Maya's defiance, an act so unprecedented in his carefully controlled domain that it still felt like a physical assault. Maya-chun, he said coldly, savoring the name like he was identifying something distasteful he'd found on his shoe. Second violin, joined us 8 months ago from, where was it? He moved to his computer, pulling up the personnel files with swift clicks, his jaw tightening as he read Maya's credentials. Juilliard graduate, honors, excellent references, a talent that should commanded respect but had instead been wasted on questioning his genius. She'll learn quickly that in my orchestra, musicians play what I tell them to play, how I tell them to play it, or they don't play at all. The threat hung in the air like the final note of a requiem, absolute and unforgiving. Good, Irina said, settling into the leather chair across from his desk and crossing her legs with deliberate elegance. Because I've already spoken to several section members about her attitude problem. Apparently, this isn't the first time she's made comments about your interpretations. She just had the audacity to say it out loud today. Irina's smile was sharp as a conductor's baton as she continued. I've documented everything. A pattern of insubordination, unprofessional behavior, inability to follow direction. The union can't protect her if we have cause. She paused, examining her manicure, gel nails, ballet pink, $150 every 2 weeks, before adding, besides, we both know there are a dozen talented violinists waiting for a chance to join the Philharmonic. Why keep someone who doesn't appreciate the privilege? The logic was sound. The execution would be swift, and neither of them considered for a moment that Maya-chun might be something more than an easily replaceable musician with an attitude problem. The termination meeting took place the following morning in the orchestra manager's office, a deliberately small room that made the 3 people sitting in judgment, Victor, Irina, and Joseph Hartman, the union representative who already looked defeated, loom over Maya in her simple chair. She'd been summoned without explanation, arriving in jeans and a sweater because she'd been on her way to a teaching gig at a community center in Queens. Her violin case clutched her hands like a shield. Victor watched her face carefully, looking for signs of fear or submission, but Maya's expression remained composed, almost eerily calm, as if she'd been preparing for this moment since the day she joined the orchestra. Ms. Chun, he began, his voice carrying the formal coldness of a judge delivering sentence. Your contract with the New York Philharmonic is being terminated effective immediately due to repeated instances of insubordination and unprofessional conduct. He slid a folder across the desk, filled with Irina's carefully manufactured documentation. Each incident minor, but collectively damning in the way small lies always are when repeated often enough. Maya looked down at the folder but didn't open it, her fingers tightening slightly on her violin case before she raised her eyes to meet Victor's with a directness that should have warned him she wasn't broken yet. So that's how it works, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the hurricane of emotions that must have been swirling beneath her calm exterior. Someone tells the truth, points out that the Emperor's new clothes are actually just expensive fabric covering nothing original or alive, and you silence them. She turned her gaze to Irina, who looked back with undisguised triumph, and something like pity crossed Maya's face, recognition of a woman who'd chosen security over integrity and would defend that choice to the bitter end. I don't need your orchestra to be a musician, Maestro Petrov, but you need musicians who can see past technique to the actual soul of the music. Good luck finding that in people who are too afraid of you to tell the truth. With that, Maya stood, tucked the termination folder under her arm without signing it, and walked out of the office with her head high, leaving Victor with the unsettling feeling that he'd just made a mistake, though he couldn't articulate exactly what it was. Well, that's handled, Irina said brightly, standing to smooth her Armani skirt as if she'd just completed a tedious but necessary task. Now we can focus on the Beethoven cycle, without distractions. I've already contacted Melissa Huang from the Boston Symphony. She's interested in the position. The conversation moved on, appointments were made, schedules were adjusted, And within an hour, Maya Chen was nothing more than a footnote in the Philharmonic's personnel records, an unfortunate hire who hadn't worked out. Victor should have felt satisfied, vindicated even. But as he returned to his office and looked out at Central Park, that strange unease persisted. He pushed it away with practiced discipline, reminding himself that he'd built his entire career on exacting standards and unwavering authority, and that second-guessing himself now would be professional suicide. That evening, Victor attended a fundraising gala at the Waldorf Astoria, the kind of glittering Manhattan event where old money and new money mingled over champagne, and made donations that kept institutions like the Philharmonic alive. He moved through the crowd with Irina on his arm, both of them playing their roles perfectly. The genius conductor and his elegant companion, accepting compliments about the upcoming season, discussing the importance of arts education, posing for photographs that would appear in the society pages of the Times. The ballroom was decorated in shades of gold and cream, crystal chandeliers casting prismatic light across women in couture gowns and men in bespoke tuxedos, the scent of expensive perfume mixing with the aroma of past hors d'oeuvres. Victor accepted his third glass of Dom Perignon and smiled at a hedge fund manager's wife, who gushed about how his interpretation of Mahler had moved her to tears, but the whole night felt somehow hollow, like he was conducting an orchestra that was perfectly in tune but playing someone else's symphony. He couldn't shake the image of Maya Chen's face as she walked out of that termination meeting. Not defeated, not even angry, but pitying, as if she'd seen something in him that he couldn't see in himself, and found it lacking. Maya stood in the subway station at Columbus Circle, her violin case open at her feet, with a handful of crumpled bills and scattered coins marking a modest morning's work. The acoustics in this particular tunnel were surprisingly good, better than some concert halls she played in. The ceramic tiles reflecting sound in a way that gave her playing a natural reverb that commuters sometimes stopped to appreciate. She'd chosen Vivaldi's Winter from the Four Seasons, a piece technically demanding enough to showcase her skill, but familiar enough that rushed New Yorkers might recognize it and pause for a moment in their relentless forward motion. Her fingers flew across the strings with precision that years at Juilliard had burned into muscle memory, but unlike in her months with the Philharmonic, here she could infuse the music with actual emotion, make it breathe and live instead of just existing. Two tourists from somewhere in the Midwest dropped a $5 bill in her case and smiled, and Maya nodded her thanks, feeling a strange freedom in this underground world where no one cared about her credentials or her opinions, just whether her music moved them or not. Her current home was a fifth-floor walk-up in the East Village, a tiny rent-controlled studio apartment that had belonged to her grandmother Papa until she'd passed away 6 months ago, leaving Maya with both a place to live and a profound sense of loss. The apartment was exactly 380 square feet. Maya had measured it once during a bout of insomnia, with a kitchenette, a bathroom the size of a closet, and a Murphy bed that she folded down each night after clearing her grandmother's old kitchen table of sheet music and composition notebooks. The neighborhood had gentrified around the building, artisanal coffee shops and fusion restaurants replacing the Chinese groceries and dim sum houses that they had loved. But inside Maya's apartment, time seemed frozen in another era. Photographs of her grandmother's journey from Guangzhou to New York lined the walls, black and white images of a young woman arriving with nothing but hope and determination, building a life through 60-hour weeks at a Chinatown laundry, so her daughter, Maya's mother, could go to college. Maya kept Papo's collection of jade figurines on the windowsill, each one catching the morning light and reminding her that survival was in her blood, that dignity wasn't about money or recognition, but about how you treated people and what you created in the darkness when no one was watching. The subway gig typically earned Maya between $80 and $200 a day, depending on tour season and weather. On rainy days, when people rushed to the stations with umbrellas and wet shoes, her take dropped significantly. She supplemented this income with 3 regular teaching jobs, 12 students at a community center in Queens where low-income kids got violin lessons for $10 a week, 2 private students in Brooklyn whose parents paid $40 per hour for lessons in their brownstones, and occasional session work, when she could get it, playing at weddings, recording background violin for commercial jingles, anything that kept her connected to music, without requiring her to compromise the one thing she had left, her artistic integrity. The math was tight enough that she still calculated every purchase, Could she afford that $7 salad, or should she stick with the $4 dumplings from the place on Eldridge Street? But she was surviving, which was more than many musicians could say. More importantly, she was free to play music the way it demanded to be played, without some arrogant conductor telling her that passion was unprofessional or that questioning his interpretation was grounds for termination. The real magic happened at night, after her last teaching session or subway shift, when Maya would return to her apartment, make a cup of jasmine tea and Papeau's old porcelain teapot, and open her composition notebooks. She'd been composing seriously since she was 14, studying under Professor Elizabeth Hartwell at Juilliard, a legendary composition teacher who'd seen in Maya's work something raw and powerful that needed to be nurtured rather than tamed. Her notebooks, 12 of them now, stacked on her grandmother's table, contained everything from song cycles to chamber pieces to the beginning of what she thought might become an opera about her grandmother's immigration story. But the project that consumed her current nights was a complete symphony, a 45-minute work for full orchestra that she'd been refining for 3 years, pouring into it everything she'd learned about music's ability to capture human emotion in its most complex forms. The first movement was fire, anger and passion, and the struggle of transformation. The second was water, mourning memory, the fluid nature of time and loss. The third was earth, grounding, determination, the solid foundation of family and tradition. And the fourth was air, freedom, transcendence, the moment when suffering transforms into something beautiful and lasting. She'd never shown it to anyone, this symphony that contained her whole heart on paper, because after what had happened with Professor Blackwell and the London Philharmonic, she'd learned that sharing your most precious work with the wrong people could destroy not just your career, but your soul. Maya's phone buzzed during a break between songs, a text from her friend Sarah Chun. No relation, just a coincidence of common surname, inviting her to a gallery opening in Chelsea. Sarah worked at Christie's auction house, specializing in contemporary Asian American art, and she'd been trying for months to pull Maya back into some semblance of a social life beyond music and teaching. Come on, there'll be wine and interesting people, and you need to remember that you're 28, not 88. The text read, followed by a string of emoji that made Maya smile despite her exhaustion. She considered declining. Her fingers ached from 4 hours of playing, and she planned to spend the evening working on the second movement transition. But something about the loneliness of the subway tunnel, the way people dropped money without making eye contact, made her type back, "Okay, but only for an hour." Life couldn't be all music and survival. Papa had taught her that, had insisted that Maya experience the fullness of life, even when life tried to narrow itself down to just struggle. So Maya packed up her violin, counted her earnings, $1.27, a decent Tuesday, and headed toward the Uptown 1 train, unaware that across the city, the great Victor Petro was about to receive news that would shatter his carefully controlled world and force him to seek out the one person he'd so recently and cruelly dismissed. The emergency board meeting was called for 8 a.m. on a Friday morning, early enough that the members had to cancel personal appointments and rush to Lincoln Center with the kind of urgency usually reserved for natural disasters or presidential deaths. Victor arrived to find the conference room already full. 15 board members, the orchestra's managing director, the head of communications, and several lawyers whose presence immediately indicated crisis-level problems. The atmosphere was thick with tension as Leonard Rothstein, the board chairman and heir to a pharmaceutical fortune, stood at the head of the table with the expression of a man delivering a terminal diagnosis. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a catastrophic situation," Leonard began, his voice grave despite his usual theatrical flair. "At 11 p.m. last night, we received an email from a musicology professor at Yale with evidence that the commissioned symphony we're set to premiere in 4 weeks, the Marcus Goldstein Symphony, for which we've already sold $8 million in tickets and built an entire marketing campaign, is plagiarized." The room erupted in gasps and frantic questions, but Leonard raised his hand for silence, and Victor felt his stomach drop as the reality of what he was hearing began to crystallize into something nightmarishly real. The projection screen at the end of the room flickered to life, displaying side-by-side comparisons of musical scores. On the left, excerpts from Marcus Goldstein's commissioned symphony. On the right, identical passages from a work composed in 1987 by Ukrainian composer Dmitry Kovalenko, who died in poverty 3 years ago. Marcus claims he was inspired by Kovalenko's work. Leonard continued with barely concealed fury. But as you can see, we're not talking about inspiration. We're talking about note-for-note theft of at least 60% of the composition. He clicked through more examples, each one more damning than the last. Whole movements lifted and barely altered, orchestrations copied precisely. Kovalenko's estate is threatening a lawsuit. The press is going to get the story by Monday morning at the latest. We have ticket holders, donors, critics, and international press all expecting a world premiere in 28 days. Leonard's eyes swept the room, landing on Victor with particular intensity. Maestro Petrov, you've conducted the rehearsals. Did you not recognize this plagiarism? Victor felt blood rushing to his face. The humiliation of being caught in what was either incompetence or willful blindness, making his voice sharper than intended as he responded. Marcus Goldstein is a Pulitzer Prize winner, a composer with decades of respected work. Why would I question the authenticity of his commission? He knew even as he said it that this was a weak defense, that a conductor his caliber should have recognized borrowed material. But the truth was he'd been so focused on technical execution that he hadn't really listened to the piece as a whole, hadn't asked himself if it felt original or derivative. The real question, Irina interjected from her seat near Victor, her voice smooth as poisoned honey, is what we do now. Can we postpone the premiere? But Leonard was already shaking his head, pulling up financial projections that showed exactly how trapped they were. $8 million in ticket sales, another $3 million in associated revenue from merchandise and streaming rights, commitments to critics and international press, the Lincoln Center rental contract with penalty clauses, and their reputation as New York's premier orchestra hanging in the balance. Postponement isn't an option, Leonard stated flatly, the weight of fiscal responsibility pressing down on every word. We need a new commission work, a complete symphony, professionally scored, rehearsed, and ready to premiere in exactly 28 days, or we face refunds, lawsuits, breach of contract penalties, and quite possibly the end of our Lincoln Center residency. The silence that followed this pronouncement was suffocating, each board member calculating the impossibility of what Leonard was demanding. Composers typically needed months or years to complete a symphony, not 4 weeks. Convincing anyone reputable to take on such a project will be nearly impossible, and even if they found someone willing, the logistics of copying parts, learning the music, and rehearsing it to performance quality in that time frame defied the laws of musical physics. I've already reached out to every major composer in my network, Leonard continued, his voice edging toward desperation. John Adams is in the middle of an opera and physically cannot do it. Jennifer Higdon is committed to a film score. Michael Tork said it would take him 3 months minimum. Caroline Shaw laughed and asked if I was joking. The list continued, each name a dead end, each rejection bringing them closer to a disaster that would make headlines around the world and potentially destroy the Philharmonic's 90-year legacy. What about lesser-known composers? Suggested board member Patricia Wu, a venture capitalist who'd made her fortune in tech and approached every problem like it was a startup pivot opportunity. Surely there are talented people who jump at this chance, who could work faster because they're hungry for the exposure? The suggestion sparked debate, arguments about quality versus speed, reputation versus innovation, the risk of compounding the plagiarism scandal by premiering work that was subpar or, worse, also plagiarized. Victor listened with growing dread, understanding that his own reputation was now tied to solving this crisis, that if the premiere failed or was canceled, his name would be forever associated with the disaster. I'll search, he heard himself saying, the words emerging from some desperate place he didn't recognize. I'll personally audition composers, review their work, find someone capable of delivering what we need. Leonard looked at him with something like pity mixed with relief. Better that the maestro shoulder some of this burden than the board alone, and nodded his agreement. Though everyone in that room understood, they were grasping at straws, hoping for a miracle that was statistically unlikely to materialize. The meeting adjourned with assignments. PR would prepare statements. Legal would negotiate with Goldstein's people in Kovalenko's estate. Development would start damage control with donors. And Victor would somehow produce a symphony out of thin air. He walked back to his office in a daze, the usually inspiring view of Central Park now looking like a taunt. All that beauty and order existing in a world where his career was imploding. Irina followed him, her presence somehow more irritating than comforting. Her suggestions: contact this person, try that approach, all variations of ideas that had already been discussed and dismissed. This is that Chinese girl's fault somehow, Irina muttered at one point, her need to blame someone, anyone, manifesting in increasingly absurd directions. If she hadn't distracted you with her insubordination, maybe you would have caught the plagiarism. Victor almost laughed at the illogic, but caught himself, recognizing that Irina's denial mirrored his own. Both of them desperate to believe that this disaster was anyone's fault but their own, that they were victims rather than participants in a system that valued prestige over substance, technical perfection over artistic truth. That night, Victor did something he hadn't done in years. He walked to Manhattan without destination, letting his feet carry him through streets crowded with Friday night revelers, couples holding hands, groups of friends laughing over shared meals at outdoor cafes. He passed Carnegie Hall and remembered his debut there at 29, the triumph that had launched him into the upper echelon of conductors, the feeling that anything was possible if you were talented and driven enough. But somewhere between that night and now, he'd lost something, the joy of music itself. The reason he'd started playing piano as a 5-year-old boy in St. Petersburg, the connection between sound and soul that had once felt as essential as breathing. Maya Chen's words echoed in his memory. You need musicians who can see past technique to the actual soul of the music. At the time, he dismissed them as the bitter complaint of someone being rightfully terminated. Now, walking alone through a city that suddenly felt vast and indifferent, Victor wondered if she'd seen something in him that had been too arrogant to see in himself, that he'd become technically perfect but artistically dead, and that perhaps this crisis was the universe's way of forcing him to remember what music was supposed to be about. The thought should have been comforting, transformative even, but it just made him angry, because accepting it meant admitting he'd wasted years, hurt people, and built a legacy on a foundation that was crumbling beneath his feet. Victor found himself at Columbus Circle Metro Station on Sunday afternoon. Though he couldn't have articulated exactly why he'd chosen to descend into the subway system when he could have been at his Tribeca loft reviewing scores or making calls to international contacts. The station was moderately crowded with weekend tourists and locals, the air thick with that distinctive underground smell of metal, electricity, and humanity in motion that normally would have made him uncomfortable. He was about to head back up when he heard it. A violin playing Vivaldi, but not the mechanical, technically precise Vivaldi he'd heard 1,000 times in conservatory performances and audition rooms. This was Vivaldi alive, breathing, the notes infused with such raw emotion that people were actually stopping mid-stride to listen, creating a small semicircle around the musician. Victor pushed through the crowd, compelled by curiosity and something deeper he couldn't name until he could see the performer clearly, and his breath caught in his throat, because there, with her eyes closed and her entire being focused on the music flowing from her violin, stood Maya Chen. She looked different from the formally dressed orchestra member he'd terminated, her hair loose around her shoulders, wearing faded jeans and a simple green sweater that had seen better days, her violin case open with maybe $40 in cash and change scattered inside. But what struck Victor wasn't her humble circumstances or even the shock of encountering her here. It was the way she played, completely unself-conscious, as if she and the violin were one organism expressing something that transcended language or logic. The piece shifted from Vivaldi to something Victor didn't recognize, an improvisation that wove together classical technique with jazz influences and what sounded like traditional Chinese melodies, creating something entirely original and utterly captivating. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, Latino, with her hair in 2 neat braids, tugged her mother's hand and whispered loudly, "Mommy, she sounds like an angel." The mother smiled and dropped a $20 bill into Maya's case, and several other spectators followed suit, moved by music that demanded nothing but gave everything. Victor stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, feeling something crack open inside his chest, a recognition that this woman playing for subway commuters understood music in a way he'd forgotten existed, and that he'd fired her not because she was wrong, but because she dared to be right. When Maya finished, the crowd applauded, and she opened her eyes with a smile that was genuine but tinged with exhaustion, the kind that comes from maintaining dignity in difficult circumstances. She thanked the listeners, packed up her earnings and was about to leave when she froze, her gaze landing on Victor standing there in his expensive cashmere coat, so obviously out of place in this underground world. For a moment, neither spoke, the awkwardness of their last encounter hanging between them like a discordant note. "Maestro Petrov," Maya finally said, her voice neutral but her body language defensive, violin case clutched protectively against her chest. "Are you lost?" The question could have been innocent, but they both heard the subtext. "What are you doing here in my world? Slumming it with the musicians you consider beneath you?" Victor struggled with how to respond, pride warring with the desperate need that had brought him wandering through the city in the first place, searching without knowing what he was searching for until this exact moment. "That improvisation," Victor said, ignoring her question because he didn't have a good answer, his conductor's instinct to assess and critique taking over. "The section where you incorporated what sounded like a pentatonic scale over modern harmonic progressions. It was remarkable. Where did you learn to compose like that?" The words came out more aggressively than intended, almost accusatory, as if her talent was somehow an affront to his earlier judgment. Maya's expression hardened, her dark eyes flashing with something between anger and bitter amusement. "I didn't lure it, Maestro. I wrote it. It's from a symphony I've been composing for the past 3 years. She shifted her violin case to her other hand, preparing to walk away from this conversation and the man who'd humiliated her. "But I'm sure you're not really interested in what a fired second violinist composes in her spare time, between subway performances and teaching kids in Queens. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have students to prepare for." She moved a step around him, but Victor's hand shot out, not touching her but blocking her path, desperation finally overwhelming pride as the magnitude of what she just said fully registered in his mind. "A symphony?" Victor repeated, his voice sharp with urgency and disbelief. "You composed a complete symphony? A full orchestral work?" When Maya just stared at him with suspicion, he felt words spilling out in an uncharacteristic rush. "The Philharmonic is in crisis. Our commission premiere in 4 weeks is plagiarized. We need a new work immediately. I've contacted every major composer in America, and they're all unavailable or unwilling to work under these constraints." He paused, seeing her expression shift from suspicion to something like understanding, though whether she'd be willing to help him was entirely uncertain. "I need to hear your symphony, Miss Chun. If it's as good as that improvisation, if you have a complete score, if you're willing to let the Philharmonic premiere it." He trailed off, realizing how insane this sounded. The great Victor Petrov begging a subway musician for help with the biggest crisis of his career, admitting that this woman he dismissed and degraded might be the only thing standing between him and professional ruin. "Please," he added, the word foreign and uncomfortable on his tongue, "but absolutely necessary. At least let me see the score." Maya studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and Victor could see her calculating, weighing her anger and hurt against the opportunity he was offering, trying to determine if this was genuine or another setup for humiliation. The subway platform around them continued its normal chaos, trains arriving and departing, commuters rushing past, the electronic signs announcing delays and service changes. But in their small pocket of space, everything felt suspended, balanced on Maya's decision. "My apartment is 15 minutes from here," she finally said, her voice carefully controlled. "You can see the score, but I'm not making any promises. And Maestro," she paused, making sure he was listening, "if this is some elaborate way to humiliate me again, if you're planning to steal my work or mock it or use it as leverage for something, I promise you'll regret it. I've already lost my position with the Philharmonic. I have nothing left to lose." "But you do." The threat was quiet but absolute, and Victor found himself nodding, understanding that he was no longer in a position of power here, that he was a supplicant and she held all the cards, and recognizing with strange clarity that this reversal was exactly what he deserved. They walked to her building in silence, Victor hyper-aware of the contrast between his $3,000 coat and her worn sneakers, the way people's eyes passed over her but tracked him with curiosity, wondering what someone like him was doing in this neighborhood. The building was old but maintained, its fire escape zigzagging up the brick facade, graffiti tags marking territory on the adjacent walls. Maya led him up 5 flights of stairs, no elevator, to a door marked 5C. And when she unlocked it and gestured him inside, Victor found himself in a space so small his Rebecca bathroom was probably larger. But what struck him wasn't the size. It was a life contained within these 380 square feet. Photographs of an elderly Chinese woman, jade figurines catching the late afternoon light, a Murphy bed folded up against the wall, and dominating the small kitchen table. Stacks and stacks of composition notebooks, loose sheet music, and pencils organized in an old ceramic jar. "Wait here," Maya said, her tone making clear this was not a social visit but a transaction. She went to the table, sorted through several notebooks, and pulled out 2 thick binders, their covers worn from being handled repeatedly, pages marked with sticky notes in multiple colors. When she turned back to Victor and held them out, her eyes met his with a challenge. "This is 3 years of my life, maestro. The entire symphony, fully scored for orchestra. Read it carefully, because if you take it, you're also taking responsibility for whether it lives or dies. Choose wisely." Victor carried Maya's score back to his Tribeca loft like it was made of glass, taking a taxi despite the subway being faster, needing to protect these binders that might contain either his salvation or just another dead end. His apartment was exactly what one would expect from a world-class conductor. 2,000 square feet of minimalist luxury with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson River, a Steinway grand piano occupying the corner like sculpture, and walls lined with first-edition musical scores and photographs documenting his career's greatest triumphs. He made himself a vodka tonic, his one concession to his Russian heritage, and settled into his leather reading chair with Maya's symphony, opening the first page with a critical I developed over 25 years of studying scores. What he saw in those opening measures made him sit forward, his drink forgotten, because Maya Chen hadn't just written a competent symphony. She created something that might be genuinely brilliant. The musical notation revealing layers of complexity and emotional depth that made his heart race with a combination of excitement and something uncomfortably close to shame. The first movement, marked Allegro con fuoco, began with a stark unison in the strings, raw, angry, insistent, before exploding into a complex interplay between the brass and woodwinds that evoked struggle and transformation with such visceral power that Victor could hear it in his mind, his decades of experience allowing him to imagine the full orchestral sound from the written page. Maya's harmonic language was sophisticated but not deliberately obtuse, drawing on late Romantic traditions while incorporating modern techniques, and what he now recognized as subtle nods to Chinese folk music, creating something that felt both timeless and completely contemporary. The orchestration was masterful. She understood how to balance sections, how to create space for individual instrumental voices, while maintaining the cohesion of the whole, how to build tension, and release it in ways that would make an audience lean forward in their seats. As Victor turned pages, filling the margins with notes and exclamation points, he realized with growing certainty that this symphony was better than anything Marcus Goldstein had ever written, possibly better than anything he himself had conducted in the last 5 years, and that the woman he'd fired for questioning his interpretation had been hiding genius-level talent behind a humble facade that he'd been too arrogant to see past. By 2 a.m., Victor had read through the entire symphony 3 times, making detailed notes about tempo suggestions, instrumental balances, and interpretive choices, his mind already racing to the logistics of bringing this music to life. He picked up his phone, hesitated for only a moment, then called Leonard Rothstein despite the ungodly hour, knowing the board chairman would be awake anyway, probably drowning his stress in scotch and legal documents. "Leonard, it's Victor," he said when the phone picked up on the second ring. I found our symphony, and it's extraordinary." He explained in rapid-fire detail about encountering Maya in the subway, seeing her score, the quality of the composition, ignoring Leonard's sharp questions about why Victor hadn't known about this woman's abilities before firing her. "I know how it looks," Victor admitted, pacing his living room with the kind of manic energy that usually only came during performances. "But listen to me. I've spent 7 hours with this score, and I'm telling you as someone who's conducted premieres of works by every major living composer, this symphony has the potential to be historic, the kind of piece people will still be playing 50 years from now." He could hear Leonard's skepticism, but also his desperate hope. 2 board members in the background asking questions. The crisis machine trying to determine if this was a solution or just another disaster in the making. The emergency board meeting reconvened at 9 a.m. Monday morning, this time with Maya present, sitting in the same conference room where her professional destruction had been planned, though now the power dynamic had shifted in ways that made Victor distinctly uncomfortable. She'd arrived in the same jeans and sweater from Sunday, carrying her violin case and a briefcase that presumably contained copies of her score, her expression carefully neutral as 15 board members and the orchestra's executive leadership assess her like she was a racehorse at auction. Leonard opened the meeting by explaining the situation. They had 25 days until the premiere, needed a complete symphony, and Victor claimed this unknown, recently terminated violinist had written something worthy of a New York Philharmonic stage. "Miss Chun," Leonard said, his venture capitalist instincts making him blunt, "we need to hear proof that this symphony exists and is of sufficient quality. Can you play something for us right now from memory?" It was a test, Victor realized with sudden clarity, designed to determine whether Maya was a fraud or a genuine prodigy, and he found himself holding his breath, silently willing her to succeed in a way he couldn't remember caring about anyone's success except his own. Maya opened her violin case with deliberate slowness, her hand steady despite the pressure of 14 pairs of eyes watching her every move, and Victor noticed the violin itself for the first time, an instrument that even he could see was exceptional, though it glowing with age and careful maintenance. Probably worth more than everything else she owned combined. "This was my grandmother's," Maya said quietly, as if she'd sensed his observation. "She bought it in 1962 from a pawn shop for $70. A century-old Italian instrument some immigrant had to sell when they ran out of money. She couldn't play it herself, but she knew someday her family would." Maya lifted the violin to her shoulder, closed her eyes for a moment as if centering herself, and then began to play. Not the opening of her symphony, but the second movement, the water music, the section Victor had noted as possibly the most emotionally devastating thing he'd read in years. The conference room fell silent as Maya's performance filled the space with sounds that shouldn't have been possible from a single instrument. She was playing the main melodic line while simultaneously providing harmonic accompaniment, using double stops and rapid position changes to create the illusion of multiple voices. Her technique so flawless that it seemed effortless, while her emotional interpretation made even the stoic Leonard blink rapidly as if fighting unexpected tears. When Maya finished, she lowered her violin and looked directly at Victor, not at Leonard or the board members who would ultimately decide her fate. And in that look, he saw both her strength and her vulnerability. She'd shown them her soul in musical form, and now they would judge whether she was good enough. And she'd done it all while knowing that just weeks ago, this same institution had decided she was disposable. "That's the second movement of my symphony," Maya said, her voice steady but soft. 64 measures of a 45-minute work that includes passages for full orchestra, chamber-sized intimate sections, and finale that requires every musician to push beyond technical perfection into emotional truth. She turned to address the full board. "I wrote this symphony about transformation, about losing everything, finding yourself in the darkness, and emerging as something stronger than what you were before. It's about my grandmother's journey from China to America. It's about my own journey from Juilliard prodigy to subway musician. And yes, it's about what happens when the world tells you you're not good enough, but you keep creating anyway because music isn't a career choice. It's who you are." The silence that followed was profound, and Victor saw several board members exchanging glances that clearly communicated they'd just witnessed something special, though whether special enough to stake the Philharmonic's reputation on was still being calculated behind expressions of careful neutrality. Patricia Wu spoke first, her venture capitalist directness cutting through the emotional aftermath of Maya's performance. "It's beautiful, clearly, but we need more than beautiful. We need a complete performance-ready score, orchestral parts copied and distributed, 3 weeks of intensive rehearsals, and absolute certainty that there are no legal issues with the composition." She looked at Maya with the clinical assessment of someone evaluating an investment. "You're asking us to premiere your symphony on one of the world's most prestigious stages after you spent 6 months playing in subway stations. Help me understand why we should take this risk." The question could have been insulting, but Patricia's tone suggested genuine inquiry rather than dismissal, and Maya seemed to recognize the difference, sitting up straighter as she prepared to make her case. "Because I've already done the hard part," Maya responded, pulling a USB drive from her pocket and sliding across the table toward Leonard. That drive contains a complete symphony in finale format with every instrumental part already extracted, transposed, and formatted for printing. I also have PDFs of the full score with all my rehearsal notes and tempo markings. She paused, meeting each board member's eyes in turn. I didn't write this hoping to sell it to the Philharmonic or any other orchestra. I wrote it because I needed to, because my grandmother's story deserves to be told in a language that best expresses human experience. Music. The fact that you need it now, that it might save both your season and my career, is coincidence or fate, depending on what you believe. But I promise you this. I'll work 24 hours a day for the next 3 weeks to make sure it's perfect, and I'll stake my reputation on the quality of this work. Leonard took the USB drive, turned it over in his hands like it might contain either salvation or destruction, and Victor saw the moment when the board chairman made his decision, a subtle shift in his expression from skepticism to calculated risk-taking. "Victor," Leonard said, not breaking eye contact with Maya, "you've reviewed the score. In your professional opinion, is this symphony premiere-worthy?" The question was designed to spread the responsibility. If this went wrong, they'd all go down together. But Victor didn't hesitate, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice when he answered, "It's not just premiere-worthy, Leonard. It's the best new orchestral work I've encountered in a decade. Maya Chun is a compositional talent on par with Caroline Shaw or Jessie Montgomery, and I believe this symphony has the potential to become a standard repertoire piece for major orchestras worldwide." He ignored Irina's shocked face from the corner, where she'd been standing as silent observer. We'd be fools not to seize this opportunity, both for the institution and for music itself. The board members conferred in low voices for several minutes, while Maya sat with remarkable composure, and then Leonard stood, extending his hand across the table. "Ms. Chun, you have a deal. We'll premiere your symphony in 25 days, with full marketing support and the entire resources of the New York Philharmonic behind it. But I want to be clear. If this fails, if the work isn't ready or doesn't meet expectations, the consequences will be severe for everyone involved." Maya shook his hand, her grip firm, her expression reflecting relief mixed with the kind of determination that suggested she understood exactly what was at stake and was prepared to deliver or die trying. The Philharmonic's announcement that it would premiere a symphony by emerging composer Maya Chun instead of Marcus Goldstein's plagiarized work detonated in the classical world. Victor spent days answering the same question. Who was Maya, and how did an unknown get this slot? Carefully highlighting her Juilliard background, while leaving out that he'd fired her weeks earlier. On Tuesday's first full rehearsal, the hall buzzed with rosin and nerves. Maya sat in the seats clutching her score, terrified and thrilled, while board chairman Leonard reminded Victor that the press would be watching and the orchestra was all in. Irina arrived last in a dramatic red dress, radiating danger. Before rehearsal could start, she stood and demanded they address the elephant in the room, accusing Maya, recently fired for insubordination, of possibly stealing the symphony. She claimed Maya left Juilliard under controversial circumstances and implied past plagiarism, producing a folder like a weapon. Maya rose furious and denied it, offering proof, dated drafts, emails, recordings. Then she revealed why her career derailed. Professor James Blackwell had assaulted her and blacklisted her when she reported him. The room froze, musicians stunned as something deeply personal was dragged into public view. Victor chose clarity over politics. He ordered Irina to apologize immediately or leave, calling her attack slander and sabotage against the survivor. Irina tried to keep pushing, but Victor cut her off and fired her on the spot, instructing staff to document everything and begin replacing the concertmaster. Irina snapped, shouting that Victor was choosing some Chinese girl, exposing her racism in front of everyone, including Asian musicians who visibly flinched. Victor shut it down coldly, saying the difference wasn't ethnicity. It was integrity and decency. Security escorted Irina out as she promised the symphony would fail. In the silence afterward, Victor invited Maya onto the stage to speak. Shaking but steady, she apologized for the ugliness, insisting music should be about connection, not power games, and thanked the orchestra for being willing to play her story. The room rose into a standing ovation, and something in Victor shifted. This felt more consequential than any performance. The next 2 weeks became a new kind of work for Victor, collaboration instead of command. He asked Maya what she intended instead of imposing his will, staying late to refine details that could turn good into transcendent. The orchestra gradually transformed into believers. David Park stepped in as acting concertmaster and brought folk-inflected passages to life. The brass became champions after a devastating second movement, and even percussion found real artistry in complex rhythms. Victor realized he'd spent years chasing technical perfection while neglecting emotional truth, and Maya's music was reteaching him what conducting could be. At the dress rehearsal, with major critics and donors present, Victor felt nerves like his debut. The symphony landed with force, urgency, grief, grounding, then lift, each movement pulling the room into silence before the applause erupted. When Maya joined him on stage, the ovation intensified, and Victor knew the desperation move had become a genuine arrival. At the donor reception, a Times critic cornered him with the headline question: how did it feel to have fired the composer of possibly the most important American symphony in decades? Victor didn't dodge. He admitted he fired her out of ego and institutional politics, publicly taking responsibility and naming her genius. Maya crossed the room and took his hand with warmth. Less publicity than forgiveness. The beginning of trust. Premiere night amplified everything. Sold-out hall. Scalper prices. The sense of scandal turning into history. Maya sat front row in a deep blue chipao honoring her heritage. Leonard gave a careful speech about discovering new voices, omitting the scandal, and Victor conducted as if channeling rather than controlling. The audience wept, leaned forward, held their breath, then exploded into bravos and a long-standing ovation as Maya stepped on stage, and Victor raised her hand in triumph. Backstage, the green room swarmed with power and praise, inquiries for commissions, interviews, and institutional self-congratulation. Victor felt uneasy taking credit for a talent he once tried to bury. He pulled Maya out of the chaos for late-night food in a quiet Chinatown restaurant tied to her grandmother's memory. Over dumplings and tea, Maya spoke about her grandmother's belief that music crosses every border and how disasters sometimes clear a path. Victor, exhausted of half-truths, confessed he was in love with her, acknowledging the age gap, the power imbalance, and his earlier harm. Maya admitted she'd been trying not to fall for him too, and failing. They talked until 2 a.m. about childhood, trauma, divorce, therapy, and dreams, and Victor walked home feeling more alive and more uncertain than he had in decades. The next morning, the Times Review crowned her, a fully formed masterwork, with Victor's conducting praise and the system criticized for nearly destroying her. He accepted the indictment as deserved and vowed to change how he led. 6 months later at Carnegie Hall, Maya premiered a commissioned violin concerto as both composer and soloist, playing her grandmother's violin. After the triumph, on a terrace overlooking Central Park, Victor proposed with a sapphire ring matching her premiere night blue. She said yes, joking they'd have the most dysfunctional musical arguments of any classical marriage. They married later on the Carnegie Hall stage after Maya conducted her symphony with the Philharmonic, reversing the original roles. Their home became a hub for mentoring and support, funding scholarships and fellowships to open doors for underrepresented artists. Maya's career soared. An opera about Chinese immigration premiered to acclaim. Their daughter Lily, nicknamed P, grew up in music, and decades later they watched her debut at Carnegie Hall. Feeling the strange circularity of time, a scandal turned miracle, a firing turned legacy, and a life still being composed measure by measure.